based at RF College Cranwell. I finished my PhD fairly recently. I graduated in December last year, and I did my PhD at the University of Nottingham. My PhD was on counterculture as an explanation of Jewish political violence and civil disobedience in Israel. And I spent some time in Israel undertaking my fieldwork. I did interviews there, and I would like to share some of the lessons learned today. Okay, how does this work? Okay, so there are just a couple of things I want to mention today. Well, just very briefly, I will, in a couple of sentences, I will summarize what my PhD was about. Then I will give you a brief overview of what my fieldwork entailed and why I did interviews, how I did the interviews, and then on top of that, I will share more tips and tricks. So just to start with, as I said earlier, my PhD was on political violence, civil disobedience, and as part of my PhD, I wanted to interview members of British Zionist and Haredi ultra-Orthodox communities in Israel. The most defining characteristic of these communities is that they are alienated from the outside, from the mainstream culture. The hardcore of these groups, they do not interact with outsiders. Clearly, that can present several challenges if you try to interview these people. In my thesis, I focus on three main areas: politics, religion, and violence. And in the interviews, I wanted to ask my participants about topics such as the two-state solution, withdrawals from settlements, role of religious leaders and sources, and threat perception. This is not what I wanted to do originally. Originally, my thesis was meant to be about terrorism. The university was not quite keen on that, and they were really not keen on the idea of me interviewing any terrorists. So I had to pivot slightly. Anyway, in the end, I went to Israel and I undertook my fieldwork. I spent 2 months and a half in Israel. I came there in mid-May 2017, and I interviewed 21 members of religious Zionist and Haredi ultra-Orthodox communities. As for the fieldwork itself, I was not able to go everywhere I wanted to go originally. Again, thanks to the whole ethical review process and several ethical considerations. So the locations were largely determined by the UK Foreign Office, which did not recommend traveling to, for example, the West Bank, which was a real shame because I wanted to interview some of the radical settler groups, but which tend to reside in the West Bank. So I focused mainly on Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, and Haifa. The university was fairly concerned about my safety, not only just because of the participants themselves, but also because of the actual location. And it was really emphasized to me that I had to monitor the security situation and the conflict dynamics all the time. And fair enough, well, in July 2017, when I was there were some outbreaks of violence. There were some shootings and stabbings in the old city of Jerusalem. And I think Hamas also shot some rockets into Israel during that time as well, but not anywhere near me. Anyway, I managed to survive and fieldwork, and I use all this data in my thesis in one way or another. So why did I choose interviews as my main method? I think interviews are an excellent method for accessing people's attitudes and values that cannot be observed, for example, in questionnaires. And I chose semi-structured interviews as they can be really helpful to understand a specific event or some specific case, and they let you explore perceptions of people in more detail, which is something I wanted to really achieve. I really wanted to understand people's attitudes regarding for example, the two-state solution. But semi-structured interviews also give you some consistency, but at the same time they give you some flexibility and the ability to develop rapport with your interviewees, which was really extremely important for me, but also challenging. And to be honest, it was very challenging to identify people willing to be interviewed in the first place. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the most defining features of these communities is that they live in alienation from the mainstream culture. They do not interact with outsiders. They have different education and workplace frameworks. They live in their own segregated neighborhoods, basically. So there were definitely some access and trust issues. So to mitigate this, I had to identify gatekeepers to introduce me to potential participants. One professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem was very helpful. So he introduced me to several, for some students of his and other people he knew, which was excellent. On the downside, this meant that people he introduced me to were more open-minded and more educated than a typical representative of these two communities. But generally speaking, I would really recommend if you go abroad, if you want to interview people, get in touch with academics and journalists because they have really good contacts. In addition to that, to develop this rapport with people I did meet, I learned some Hebrew. Obviously, I was not good enough to actually conduct interviews in Hebrew, but I think it was really helpful because it helped me to develop this rapport with people. It was a good conversation starter. On the other hand, there was some selection bias because I only interviewed people who were fluent-ish in English. Other access issues were that in the Haredi communities, the ultra-Orthodox communities, men do not interact with women they are not related to. One story from one of my interviewees, he told me that he had never talked to a woman he was not related to until he married one. So there's always very little you can do about this gender issue when you want to interview someone, but you still need to be aware that this can present challenge. There were also some other methodological challenges with semi-structured interviews, such as validity, generalizability, and such. So my study consisted of 21 participants, therefore it cannot be considered as representative of the overall population. But even given the small sample size, some there could be some indication of trends within the wider population. So overall, I think interviews can be really useful. However, people who agreed to be interviewed are not representative of their own communities for one big reason, and that is that they were willing to be interviewed in the first place. Because as I said earlier, and as per my theoretical framework, representative members of these communities, particularly Haredi communities, do not interact with outsiders. Lastly, one thing that I would mention about interviews is that interviews do not give you access to facts, but to views. For example, one of my interviews told me that Palestinians do not want to have their own state. And again, whilst this doesn't necessarily have to be very true, it is a data and it was really useful for me. I'm conscious that I'm running out of time. So just to finish off with more tips and tricks, couple of things before you embark on fieldwork. Plan in advance, because sorting out all these ethics forms at the university or some other research bodies can take a while. Another thing is, if you go abroad, you may need to sort out your visa. If to some countries you may not need visa. As a Slovakian citizen, I don't need a visa to Israel. But when I rang the embassy, I was clearly told that if they catch me doing interviews without a visa, I would get into trouble. So maybe do consider getting, do check out if you need any visa. I got student visa in the end. Be culturally sensitive, be aware of local customs and even barriers. For example, when I conducted interviews and walked around some religious neighborhoods, I had to dress according to religious modesty laws. Then if you can, learn just the language just a little bit. You don't necessarily have to be fluent, but again, it can be really helpful if you can, if you know some of the language, because it can help you develop this rapport. And when you do your interviews, make sure that your supervisor or someone, a family member or friend, knows where and when these interviews take place. Try to do your interviews in a public place, just to be on safe side. On several occasions I did not do that myself, but it's safer to do it in public sphere. Ideally, you would not like to do your interviews in a noisy place. I did mine in cafes, restaurants, parks even. And I wasn't conscious of any noisy background at the time, but when I started transcribing my interviews, I very much realized the background was pretty noisy, which complicated the whole transcription process. Then be really conscious of your environment, be sensible, be aware of any security considerations. For example, I try to use the public transport in Israel as little as possible, considering many terror attacks in Israel in the past did take place on public transport. Also, do ensure that you do all the things that the university asks you to do, like ethics forums. Ensure participant anonymity. I was also very keen that the Israeli authorities may confiscate my data. So I was kind of sneaky about it. So, for example, when I recorded something, I sent it to cloud, then I deleted it from my recorder. Same about the consent form. I took photo, sent it to cloud, and then just shred it. Also be prepared that some people may not be willing to be recorded. So bring pen, paper, extra pen just in case. Same for the recorder, have your spare batteries on you just in case. Again, I learned the hard way. And lastly, one thing that I would say is that things do go wrong, and that's absolutely fine. People may decline the interviews. You may not be able to interview people you would like to interview, and ultimately the thesis may not be perfect, and that's completely fine, because PhD is just a start. It's not the end, and you have your whole future ahead of you. Oh, and lastly, put on sunblock. I also learned the hard way. Thank you.
Thanks, Veronika. That was really interesting. And I love when you, Veronika is on the committee for the DRN, so we've had plenty of meetings and chats together, but you don't always get to hear about someone's actual research. So yeah, I enjoyed hearing that. Thank you. Okay, Alex, we're going to move on to you now. Are you able to share your screen?
Super. Hello, everyone. Can you all hear me? Super. Nice one. So, just do the share screen and slides. And we're on. Right. So, hello, everyone. Hope you're all doing okay, keeping safe and everything. So first of all, a really big thank you to Hannah and the DRN for inviting us here for this webinar, which, you know, it's a really nice kind of continuation of some of the defence research chat Twitter hours that have been going on over the past couple of months. So it's nice to kind of continue those conversations in a different format. So today I'm going to speak for about 10 minutes or so about the fieldwork that I did during my PhD, which was on Indian counterinsurgency in the country's peripheral northeast region. So the fieldwork itself involved stints in both Delhi and in northeast India during 2016. I'm going to speak in particular about one challenge with which I was grappling with during fieldwork, and that was this kind of idea of positionality. And I'm really interested in learning about, you know, some of the other experiences. You know, Veronika's presentation was really interesting, so I'm hoping that, yeah, this kind of I can learn myself about positionality from these discussions as well. So I will begin with a bit of context. I'll offer a very, very brief overview of my field work, and then I'll go on to discuss positionality, my attempts to kind of negotiate that, and also kind of ethical questions of power and positionality when doing overseas field work. So a bit of context about where we're talking about then, and the challenges of researching counterinsurgency in northeast India. So although Kashmir tends to get a lot more attention internationally, the northeast has almost constantly faced insurgency since independence in 1947. As a result, much of the region has been, it was pretty much sealed off for decades. It was pretty much impossible for Westerners, foreign researchers, journalists to get into the region, and access only really started opening up until around the kind of 1990s. Since then, there's been a drop in outright violence against state targets, and gradually you see in this process of opening up that's ultimately allowed me to do my field work. But that's not the whole story. So my PhD tried to focus on how the different kind of political relationships have emerged between state and insurgent actors, predicated on varying kind of degrees of conflict, of limited cooperation, of active cooperation, collusion, containment. It tried to explore how counterinsurgents in those political relationships tried to renegotiate their terms, even during a shift towards ceasefires, peace talks, this kind of thing. So back to the fieldwork discussion. As a result, it's still it's a militarized setting, and it's a sensitive fieldwork site. There are a lot of real challenges still in doing research in the northeast. So the clearances process that took absolutely ages. You know, lots of the files for studying the region in archives remain classified. When I did finally get there, I found myself grappling with, you know, the battle for perceptions that takes place in any counterinsurgency campaign, in the kind of narratives that were being presented to me. Visa delays also meant that I landed in India at absolutely the wrong time of year, which is the middle of May. I love New Delhi, I absolutely love it, but I did not love the 48 degrees heat. That was not fun. Yeah. I also needed another layer of clearances to go up to the northeast. By the time that I got those, it was just about monsoon time. Brilliant. So this photo is a photo from my hotel room in a place called Dimapur in Nagaland. I'd actually been at a private archive just out of town that day, but it started absolutely hammering it down, and we ended up having a very panicked drive back to town up some roads which basically turned into waterfalls. It was kind of like, for a kind of mental image of this, think like the first Jurassic Park film, if you've seen it, where that guy drives off and his car gets stuck and little dinosaur gets him. It was absolutely terrifying. Really, you know, it was very stressful. So, but yeah, what this kind of indicates then is that there were real kind of physical, infrastructural, and kind of weather-related challenges in doing research in this part of the world. So a very brief overview of my field work and methods to contextualise. I spent May to October 2016 in India, based mainly in New Delhi and Guwahati in Assam. And I was taking trips out to different states in the northeast from my kind of basing location in Assam. I conducted interviews with retired security forces personnel, army, police, paramilitary, politicians, bureaucrats, civil society actors, journalists, academics. I did a bit of archival research, and I also built in a limited kind of observational component as well. So the image that I've kind of shared here just gives you a bit of a sense of how I try to allow the data collection processes to speak to one another, those kind of triangulation processes that took place. So as part of securing access to be able to go to India, I negotiated 2 kind of visiting affiliations or fellowships with 2 very different research institutes. So the first was a defence, Ministry of Defence Finance think tank called the Institute for Defence Studies and Analysis, which is based in the cantonment in New Delhi. And this was really crucial for getting access to India and also getting access to many of the kind of former military kind of participants that I was interested in speaking to. The second was called the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Guwahati in Assam. This is much more of an academic kind of institute, and many of its faculty coming from a much more kind of critical perspective with kind of backgrounds in social activism, this kind of thing. So it was 2 very contrasting institutes with which I was affiliated. So this brings me to the main challenge that I wanted to talk about today, positionality. So I was acutely aware that ultimately producing knowledge in the study of conflict, you know, it's very much a relational thing. It involves power relations, right? And that can have a bearing on the data that we collect. You know, I was a young, relatively inexperienced PhD student from the UK. You know, I was clearly positioned as an outsider to those who have lived the dynamics that I was studying. There's quite a considerable degree of suspicion of foreign scholars kind of poking their noses in sensitive internal issues like armed conflict and military operations, as you'd imagine. At the same time, my positionality as a student of counterinsurgency, which is very much a kind of a policy-oriented field in the located in the context of the war on terror, sometimes generated an assumption of either normative alignment with the Indian state or even a kind of a Western spook, an intelligence agent, as you know, this kind of thing. So they were some of the kind of perceptions that I encountered. The outsider positionality can be renegotiated to a degree through the construction of what Ramain Malajak and Dipali Mukhopadhyay call multiple tribes, or essentially kind of social support networks in the field. So this is where the contrasting positionalities of the institutions that I was affiliated with was really, really helpful. And it was, I guess, being linked with a government affiliated think tank on the one hand, and an academic institute with very kind of critical minded activist kind of faculty helps in the creation of multiple collegial and social support networks from a variety of backgrounds, where, you know, I could really draw on a wide range of advice for navigating the field. So that was really, really helpful in just as a source of support. So when I was approaching participants, referring to both of these institutes, I kind of found allowed me to craft a bit of an external positionality that was neither neither a kind of firefighter or a fire starter, as Magnus Ranstorp puts it, but a student of combustion. So it was about saying, look, I'm affiliated with both of these. I'm not coming down on one side, but I'm just here to learn. I'm a student that's here to learn. So this helped to navigate some of the extremes of how my external positionality was framed, but it didn't eliminate those concerns altogether. The perceptions that are listed in the previous slides were still evident. People still thought I might be a spy, or I'm meddling, I'm a human rights activist meddling in internal affairs, this kind of thing. So in the face of reluctance, suspicion, this often, it mainly involved a really detailed, quite often personal opening up on my part of my background, my commitment to academic study, and just kind of building that into the informed consent process, really, to try and overcome this challenge. So the power relations between the researcher and the research are, they're crucial to consider during data collection. On the one hand, respondents from, I was interviewing quite a range of respondents, and they were all keen to share their side of the story. So this in itself raises ethical considerations surrounding what can be called the imperialism of knowledge production, that collating and interpreting these kind of stories entails. So this underlined the importance of having a in-depth and honest informed consent process to clearly kind of outline objectives and expectations of my project. On the other hand, doing research in settings affected by conflict can create, as Maljak and Mukhopadhyay note, what they call guest and host dynamics that can actually upend the conventional understanding of investigator-subject power relations. So the most serious instances of this, for example, were when state oversight kicked in. Police want to know where you are, who you're talking to, what you're talking about. Again, it was this kind of thing had to be reflected in changes to the informed consent process, and where I made clear, look, this is the kind of situation that I'm facing, so bear in mind those limitations to the protection of anonymity, and make your decision to participate based on an awareness of the context that I'm facing. So a real example of kind of limited power in that sense. My limited power was also clear when doing interviews with elites, so often very well trained, influential and experienced, maybe retired politicians, military practitioners, very well versed in public relations and spelling out the official line. So, I mean, clearly I couldn't, as an inexperienced Western doctoral researcher, I couldn't negate these power relations altogether. But what I tried to do is develop a strategy of kind of what I called kind of temporarily renegotiating positionality within the interview, by really kind of going overboard with my preparation of all the kind of areas that they would want to cover, and really using that to try and demonstrate my in-depth knowledge of the subject area, which tended to steer conversations towards a bit more depth than the kind of official line, the kind of generic narrative, although it obviously couldn't completely eliminate that. But that was another kind of interesting challenge related to power and positionality. I'll leave it there at this point with a picture of some lovely rice wine, which I was treated to in a village in Nagaland. It's really nice, a bit potent, but yeah. I'd love to discuss this further, so particularly how others have come up against and developed strategies around challenges of positionality, whether that be going abroad somewhere, or indeed positionalities of race, of gender, of class as well, So I'd be really interested to know how these kind of challenges have been encountered. If you're interested in knowing a bit more about my actual research, you can check out the article here, which draws on some of my fieldwork insights. But other than that, thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. I've heard Alex has been part of our sort of counterinsurgency group within that's sort of come out of the DRN, I guess. So I've heard Alex talk about his research before, but not so much about his methods. So, and as someone who is a bit of an insider-outsider in my research, it's interesting to hear a more outsider kind of position. So yeah, thank you. Okay, we'll move on to Sophie, last but not least. Thanks.
Hi, everybody. I hope I'm now unmuted, so that should be fine. I haven't got a PowerPoint presentation. I'll share my screen in a little while, just for a couple of seconds, but rather I'll just talk a little bit. So I've been asked to talk a bit about archival research. I am going to have kind of split this into pre-COVID and post-COVID views of this, because I know it's sort of elephant in the room, but particularly for archival researchers, and there may be some of you out there that are embarking on research that have really struggled with this. So I did want to touch on that when I speak, but I also will talk about sort of the life before COVID as well. I mean, when I started, so my PhD, I started in 2016, finished in 2019 last year, is on the early politics of air power. So essentially, I was looking at the period roughly 1917 to 1929. So basically everybody I was interested in is dead. So I had to get to know them through archives, memoirs, books, secondary sources, you name it. I'm going to talk today, clearly any of you who have got lots of experience in archives, you may be able to add to Q&A, but or maybe comment in the questions. But I'm aiming this more at people that are at the earlier stage of their journey, because certainly for me, when I started my PhD, I had never been to an archive in my life. I started and there wasn't an awful lot of detailed guidance about what to expect. Clearly, what I learned is that no archive is the same as any other, as anybody who's been to them will know. But I'm happy to take basic questions, because there are those questions about what do I take with me to the archives or something like that. If people want to ask those questions, I'd love to answer them, but I'm going to talk more about the journey of using them. So starting off with pre-COVID, for me, what was really interesting is that my whole thesis sponsorship was based on me cataloguing the papers of somebody called Lord Brabazon, who's a polymath is an easy term for him. There's lots of other terms I could use. Anyway, he was the first Englishman with an Irish background to fly in England, and he ended up being a member of a peer in the House of Lords and had an interesting career throughout in between those two periods. I started cataloguing his papers, and that was a really useful exercise. I'm not suggesting everybody who starts a PhD or whatever can catalogue papers, or even would I recommend it. But I read everything from his family's wills to his early school reports to letters from his brother who was in the trenches in the First World War, to the transcripts of him on desert island discs in the 1950s. And that gave me a sense of a person. And in a sense, it's interesting, Veronika talking about interviews, and Alex as well. I was kind of getting to know a dead person really, really well. I found it really useful with him and others to write think pieces about what they were like, what, how they felt, what they were, what constituted their personality. In fact, the correspondence with his parliamentary agent, because he stood for Parliament and was an MP for some years, gave me much more of an insight really into him than anything. And that, so my thesis wasn't about him, although the thesis proposal had been. He led me into networks, and archives are just networking. There's using your contacts with archives, that's one sense of networking, but the archive leads you from one place to another. It's all about networking. For my research, I just for your information, in case you have any questions, I went everywhere from universities like Liverpool and others, parliamentary archives. I spent a lot of time at Windsor Castle, in the Royal Archives, museums, including everything from the RAF Museum, Imperial War Museum, some small ones, which I'll come on to, and I went overseas, and I'll come on to that too, because although that's not open to us right this second, that was extremely useful. Obvious point is that your first, once you've identified an archive, either resources, archives, or manuscripts that you want to look at, is negotiating access. And I think first thing I'd say is it's really important to negotiate that in as a helpful and open a way. As I say, all archives are different, but most of them do have some information on their websites, and it's worth really going through that, so that when you make first contact with an archivist or librarian, you ask pertinent questions, you give plenty of information about what you're researching, but you also acknowledge that you understand that they're only open on a Wednesday afternoon or whatever the issue is, because there's, I think, nothing more irritating from them than somebody just fires off an email without much thought. I've found that I've got so much help, and that's the other thing I say, these people are heroes. They need thanking and acknowledging, because if you can build a relationship with them, you're halfway there to getting what you want. So that establishing contact, that first email, that first whatever phone call, but probably email, is really important. Moving on note taking, this is incredibly personal, but this is a bit where I'm going to share my screen so you can see my utterly disorganized way of doing things, but I found it organized to me. It will be different to everybody, but when I was first starting, I ended up just asking lecturers in my history department at Exeter what they did, and I got as many, obviously, different answers as I asked different people. But I'm just going to share this in case it's of any use to anybody who is thinking about this. So let me hang on a sec, share my screen. I'm just trying to find out how. Oh yeah, no, hang on, there we go. Right, so the first thing is that I had, oh, I closed you, I meant to, oh, here we go. So can you see an Excel spreadsheet? Because I can't see it now, but you can all see it. Anyway, so essentially you can see at the bottom, I chose to categorize things by different archives, so Churchill Archive, the Royal Air Force Museum, and this is from the NARA, so the National Archives at College Park in Washington, DC, where, for example, I found some fascinating documents about war plans that the United States were discussing the chances of Britain attacking the United States in the 1920s. And so these are the kind of notes I made. But I mean, the most important thing is all the cross references, the numbers, the dates, the details. And what I also used, and I'm going to now, if I unshare and then share again, the other technique I used was, and can you see my Evernote now? Yeah. So this is Evernote, and this is the same record. So this is the photograph of some of the documents that came under that Excel record. So under box 296, so I can search for 296 and 2423730 in the corner. And I love that this is the record that says history amply bears out the fact that whenever a nation gets too strong and becomes too serious a rival to Britain, either on the seas or in a military sense, she does not stop until she has that nation completely blocked. And failing this, she fights and destroys it, first getting every possible assistance from all other actions necessary to accomplish her end. I share that just because it's one of my favourite bits of archives, apart from some lessons learned from Afghanistan. But that was in the 1920s. And, you know, being able to search my Excel spreadsheet for American invasion and then being able to cross-reference it, because I knew it was an Evernote and I'd taken photographs, it's obvious stuff, I guess. But if you're starting out, sometimes people don't tell you these things. Photograph everything. Phones are fine. Clearly, sometimes you have to get permissions, and occasionally you have to pay to use your phone. But and this comes on to the post-COVID thing, I have 3,000 photographs from the National Archives in College Park. I've been through them all once, which took me about 3 weeks, but not in detail. I've got a treasure trove of things to research. So what I would say is, you know, I didn't know I was planning for a pandemic, but clearly I was in some way. The and another point I just want to bring out about going to the National Archives. So clearly in this environment it's difficult, but look outside the box. I was looking at the Royal Air Force in Britain, its creation, the political arguments going on in Whitehall, but actually what I decided to try and do was go and look at what the Americans thought. So all of those records I've just shown you are the US Embassy in London, and it's the diplomats in the military attaches in London writing back to Washington DC with all of their views, everything from what they thought of the royal family to the press to war plans to the Air Force to Lord Trenchard. And so I'd always try and think in reverse, who's going to be talking about what you're interested in, because it's not just the people that are the main characters, it's the people talking about those characters, and those are where archives can bring up amazing stuff. I wanted to, I'm out of time, small archives, very important. So, well, almost not archives. So I wanted to find out stuff about the Royal Air Force Benevolent Fund, which used to be the RAF Memorial Fund. I asked the chief executive if he had any information. He had a bunch of boxes under a staircase, and he let me go in, and I probably was the first person to read the minutes of that Memorial Fund since they were put in a box however many years ago. Similarly, Brabazon and some of his counterparts, the politicians I was interested in, had been to Harrow. The historian at Harrow was so helpful with giving me full access to all copies of the Harrovian, which are locked in their website, but he was delighted I'd asked. So back to that relationship. Just in my last minute, because I know we've got to stop, post-COVID, I mean, research is, you can't find everything. In the narrow documents, there was, I can't remember the name of the guy, but I wanted to shoot him, except he's long dead, because he's deleted so many of the files that I'd found, and I got the, you know, the record brought up and realized that they'd all been destroyed. You can only find what's out there, and you can't access everything. So all research involves stopping when either time, resources, or availability of sources stops, and that's the same when we're restricted to online. Right now, researching for a book, I've got a massive wish list, so use your time organising where you want to go, what you want to look at, really going into people's websites lists. Online resources, I'd recommend the Institute of Historical Research of Historical Research. They've got a list of lots of online free to access, open access resources are masses, just not British history only, lots of history all around the world. So go to the IHR. The local newspapers, British Library is absolutely fantastic. I've learned so much more about something I'm researching from reading the Lichfield Mercury than I would have done from practically any other newspaper. Similarly, I'm busy translating from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, which has a fantastic online resource, just stunningly interesting. Also sharing, if you know other researchers, if somebody's trying to research, you know, American attaches in the 1920s, if they emailed me, I'd of course help them share what I have at the moment in these times of crisis particularly. So do look for other researchers. You're all good at connecting on Twitter and so on and so forth. And then I go back to relationships with archivists and librarians. I've been working recently with the National Aerospace Library. They have got some time. I mean, they're busy, some are furloughed clearly, but actually I know that there are librarians at the National Aerospace Library in Farnborough are actually going in to photocopy pages of things for people. Now, not every archive is going to do that, but it's always worth asking. And my final point is history's in the gaps as much as in what you can read. And I think thinking now is the time to think about the things we'll